All right, so let's go through this activity. So let me bring up, there we go, the assignment. All right, so the first one was actually the hardest one, I think. At least from what I was saying, I think that this first one is actually the trickiest of all of these. So is this a topic that admits of inquiry? At least as written, I would say it is not. We could maybe derive a topic for inquiry, but just as the things are currently stated, there's no contradiction between Cameron tending to vote Democrat and Kayden tending to vote Republican. Those two things are both true. There's no contradiction. Now, we could maybe start an inquiry if we shift it slightly. If we ask maybe, why does Cameron tend to vote Democrat? Right? That we could inquire into. Because we could offer different hypotheses. Maybe one person says, well, it's because of their parents that they vote the way that they do, and another person says it's because of the media they watch that they vote the way that they do. Right? Those would be contradictory explanations. Maybe we could ask who's voting the right way or something. That's a subject that maybe could be inquired into. But at least as written, this is not a topic of inquiry. There's no real disagreement. And in the second example, we see a case where there is indeed much more obviously something to investigate. Right here, we do have a candidate for inquiry. The key thing, they both can't be right. They're both, and that's the sense that we have a real disagreement, something that really can be investigated. So any questions with either of those first two? Again, you just unmute yourself if you want to raise something. Okay. Let's go to the third one then. So Jody finds Indian food too spicy, while Jaylene finds many kinds of food too plain. Again, here probably more obviously, no real disagreement, so no real inquiry. There's just nothing to say on the subject. Jaylene maybe thinks it's like, or maybe like Jody, Jaylene maybe thinks it's too bad that Jody finds Indian food too spicy or something, but it's not the same thing as disagreeing on the subject. Whereas here we have a real disagreement, even though we're still dealing with a question of taste in some sense, maybe, or individual preferences or something. People indeed can debate what the best restaurant is, what's the superior restaurant. Both can't be true. And it's going to be probably a weird inquiry, right? Like, I mean, how would we actually investigate what the best Indian restaurant in town is? What kind of evidence would we look for? Maybe it's going to be contentious. And indeed, one of the things we'd have to figure out is even what our criteria for best Indian restaurant's going to be. But that itself is precisely something we can talk about. Right? That itself is precisely something we can look at, give reasons, argue about, dispute, disagree. Right? And so it's something that we can really investigate. So the pair of 5 and 6, both of these are actually things that can indeed be investigated. Right? Again, even though it's sort of personal preference, what's the most exciting team to watch, it's actually something you could talk about. You could give reasons for why I think this team is more exciting to watch than that team is more exciting to watch. Again, it would probably be weird. It'd be very different from, say, the political debate or a scientific debate or something, right? But it is indeed a debate people could have. It's something you could legitimately talk about for an extended period of time, investigate, give reasons in defense of your view. Think of it that if you could sort of defend why you're saying what you're saying, that's a case where you could inquire. I can't defend, or Jody couldn't defend why she finds Indian food too spicy. She just does. But if it's something you can give a defense of, it's something that can be inquired into. And then similarly, which team is more likely to win the Super Bowl? That's a more maybe obvious one, right? But here again, we have a real inquiry. You could give reasons to defend either claim. And the last of these, the last pair, I suppose, right? I want to go to the movie, you want to go out to eat. Again, just as it sounds as if there's a disagreement, and the next one shows why it sounds that way. But just strictly speaking as written, there is no disagreement here. I can do what I want, you can do what you want, no disagreement. The reason why it sounds like there's a real disagreement is really because you're sort of presupposing that it's what's going on in case number 8, right? Case number 8 is just making it more, making maybe the potential disagreement that we're going to do the same thing together. There we have a real disagreement. We can't, I mean, maybe we could do both actually, but if we're treating these as at least exclusive, that we're just going to go to a movie or we're just going to go out to eat, right? That's a contradiction. Both of those things can't be true. We can then discuss which should we collectively do. And so then if we can discuss it, we could have an inquiry to resolve the question. Figure that really anything you can talk about seriously, that is a topic for inquiry. So it really is almost anything. What can you inquire into? Pretty much anything. Even stuff that seems as if it really is just kind of questions of taste or whatever. Some of the best conversations I've ever had are me and a friend debating whether or not we liked an album or not, or something like that, right? Like, it's fun to do that sort of thing. Like, it's something that you can talk about. You can talk about it there for better or worse. All right. How are people doing? Have any questions with any of those problems? All of that seemed doable, seemed reasonable. All right. So just get that turned into me by the end of the day. Same format. Pretty much what everyone did last time worked just fine. So whatever you were doing works. So the basic idea of what you did last time. Get those into me. Here, unlike, there's actually more right and wrong answers here, so I'll actually be grading on that basis. But we just went over everything, so everyone should have all the right answers. So perfect. All right. So let's do one more thing before we call it a day. One last little idea from chapter 1 I wanted to talk a little bit about. And then we'll get ready to move to chapter 3. There's advanced warning for you all. The class is going to get quite a bit harder once we get to chapter 3 in the book. Chapter 3 in the book is when we're actually going to start getting like problems, really, and stuff to do. So the first 2 chapters are introductory, useful, good way to get into the swing of the semester a little bit. So one last little introductory thing from chapter 1 I want us to talk about. And before we end for the day. So let's go back to the whiteboard for a second. I want to talk about this difference that we brought up between a debate and an inquiry. They both seem similar. They both seem related, perhaps, in some senses. But I want to suggest that there's actually a pretty fundamental difference between these 2 activities. In a debate, your goal is to win the debate. Think of it, you'd have your side that's declared the best side or the right side. And hopefully in the debate it would be getting declared the best because it was the true one, but it just doesn't have to be the case. This doesn't have to be connected to any real sense of you actually being right. There's all kinds of ways you can win a debate through tricky means, what we're going to call logical fallacies, like bad arguments that seem like good arguments. I take it this is not a newsflash to any of you. I take it you're all well aware that it's possible to cheat in these debates, right? The hope is that, if everyone's debating earnestly, maybe we'll come to the truth, but the orientation just isn't toward truth. The goal is victory, right? Victory is what this is oriented toward. Inquiry is not oriented toward victory. Right? If I'm proven wrong in an inquiry, great, because that means we discover the truth. And that's the only goal. And we should pause for a second and just reflect on how difficult this actually is. What a difficult stance that is to actually adopt. You know what sucks? Being proven wrong about something, right? We all hate it, right? It's not fun, but it's super unclear why we don't like it, right? I mean, like if I believe false things, that's potentially really harmful, depending on what the. I mean, if it's about, we're talking about Star Wars movies or whatever, maybe the stakes aren't that high. But at least with some beliefs that I have, there are huge stakes. So I believe certain things about COVID-19, and I act in the world on the basis of those beliefs. And if I'm wrong, I could literally die, right? Like literally die, right? And other people could perhaps literally, I maybe could kill someone if I'm wrong with my beliefs, right? The stakes are potentially enormous. And yet I suspect, even knowing that, at least a part of me would recoil from being shown that I was wrong. Right? Even at the cost of my, quite literally, potentially at the cost of my life, I might recoil from that, right? At least some part of me. I remember a time when I was in college and a group of us had been out late, doing what college people do, you all know. And I almost walked in front of a car and one of my friends sort of grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back. And I was kind of annoyed with her. But that's crazy, right? Like that's insane that I was annoyed with her because I sort of like wanted to be like, well, I knew what I was doing, I'm fine, right? Right? This sort of like sense of wanting victory. So this activity of inquiry that we're sort of promoting in this class, right? This is a difficult one for all of us to do. Right? This is a challenge. What we'll talk about as we get later into the semester, near the end of the semester. There are features of how our brains work that make us not want to do this. Right? There are features of human psychology that make us not want to do this. So it's difficult. It's a seriously difficult task to do to sort of live up to this standard of inquiry. How can we do it? How can we sort of provisional way? How can we sort of like start moving toward the rather high standard that inquiry presupposes? And so what the book, the term that the book gives for this is that we should sort of cultivate a kind of attitude. And the book calls this attitude the spirit of inquiry. Right? So sort of like an attitude we should try to cultivate within ourselves as best as possible. And we're going to talk a lot more as the semester goes along about all three of these features, but it's worth just introducing them now, at least sort of in a provisional sense anyway. So the first thing that the book talks about is as one of these attitudes is the idea of fallibilism, or the attitude of fallibilism. This is the recognition that it's possible that I am wrong about what I believe. Now, the fact that it's possible that I'm wrong, I've said this before, I'm going to keep saying it. The fact that it's possible that I'm wrong doesn't mean that I'm actually wrong. Right? We would have to investigate to discover if I'm right or wrong in my beliefs. But if I adopt this as a kind of attitude, I'm moving away from this desire for victory. Right? Because for the desire to victory thing, I have to sort of assume that I'm right. If I'm not assuming that I'm right, better possibility that things are going to go well. What this fallibilism will lead to is, hopefully at least, is two other kind of attitudes. So one is called open-mindedness. This is again, it's a kind of attitude, a desire to want to see why people are saying things that disagree with things that I already believe. And again, this doesn't just mean I'm going to give up my beliefs to adopt their beliefs, right? That's not the case at all. That would actually be just as harmful to inquiry if I did that, right? Precisely, this is sort of an attitude almost of a kind of like curiosity, maybe. You can almost think of this, right? Where like, I kind of just want to know why people are saying things that are different from what I'm saying. I'm going to investigate the matter. And then to do that well, that in and of itself, though, is quite challenging. The hope is that we'll be able to cultivate one last virtue, if you want to put it that way, the virtue of fair-mindedness. And this is probably the trickiest and the hardest one, even when people sort of are trying. This is really hard to do. So let's just define what I mean by it. Fair-mindedness is, as much as possible, you ignoring your pre-existing biases when you evaluate evidence. Think of it as the sort of it. You need to treat all evidence equally, whether that evidence proves you right or whether that evidence proves you wrong. This is really hard to do. When I was talking about there are features of our brain that actually interfere with this, the features of our brain that most get in the way are actually, they get in the way of fair-mindedness. There's things, for example, called confirmation bias, which is our tendency to literally cognitively not recognize evidence that disagrees with our pre-existing beliefs about the world. Right? This is a feature of how our brains work that's going to try to get in the way of this. Our natural tendency is going to be to like evidence and think that evidence that confirms what we already think is right, and to think that evidence that disagrees with what we already think, there must be something wrong with it. And doing that will do sort of more harm to this activity of inquiry than anything else we can do. Again, this is why it can be helpful to carry out these inquiries with other people. As I was sort of jokingly said last time, people who will call you out on your bullshit, right? Like, if I really have believed something strongly, it'll be helpful to be talking with someone who doesn't agree with it, because they'll point out things that I might otherwise overlook, ways that I am misinterpreting the evidence to sort of tip the scales in my own favor. So these three virtues are things that we're going to need to try to sort of cultivate within ourselves as much as possible as part of this sort of like activity of rigorous inquiry. Not saying it's easy, not saying it's going to be straightforward or simple. There's real challenges here. It is doable, and it's also something that you should see as more of like a matter of degree than an all or nothing thing, right? It's something we should sort of strive to do. We're never going to free ourselves of all biases. It's not possible. Like literally, it's not possible. A bias is just some pre-existing thing that you haven't examined yet, and there's always going to be pre-existing things you haven't examined, right? You can't get rid of them. What you can do, though, is try to minimize them, right? And one of the things we'll be working on this semester is some resources for analyzing arguments and analyzing the claims that people make that aren't sort of going to fall prey maybe to these biases, resources that we can use, sort of techniques and approaches we can use that are, if not bias free, at least minimize the negative impacts that our biases might have on the discussions. So that's pretty much what I have for today. That takes us pretty much all the way through chapter 1 in the textbook. Anyone have any thoughts, questions, comments about anything we've talked about today so far, or anything else from chapter 1? All right, awesome. So look over those homework problems. They'll give you a good sense of how well you're doing, how well you're grasping some of the material. If you're finding yourself with questions, we got office hours all of next week before the next exam that you can use to go over anything you'd like to talk about. You can always bring questions back in the class as well. As far as I know, unless something pretty dramatically changes, I think next week will still be remote. After that, I don't know. After that, we might go back to face-to-face. I hopefully will be told that sooner rather than later, just so I have time to let you all know and get things adjusted. But at least next week anyway, we should be remote. So it should be the same basic format that we've been doing so far up to this point. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next week. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.